Cool. Nice. Well, welcome everybody. Good to be with you today. So hope you're all well. My name is Emile. I'm one of the trainers at Fosse, an organization some people in the chat will be familiar with. Usually my focus is teaching is related to cloud and DevOps, but today I'm going to go over some React, with an aim for you to be able to do some self-study later on this afternoon on Next.js. I've got a small repository, and actually I'll take the opportunity to start sharing my screen. So the HTML is basically giving us the structure of our website. And as you can see, if you're unfamiliar with HTML, this is essentially the boilerplate for our application. So what we can see right now is basically everything the browser will display is contained within these body tags. And right now we've got an empty div with an ID of root. And if we load this application into the browser, and I'll just go through that process again, what we'll end up seeing is essentially an empty window, which is not very helpful for a few reasons. And this is where Next.js really comes into its own. The only thing we can see is we've got this React session, and that's coming from the title tag, as I said, we have in the index.html file right now. So just to recap, browsers are going to sort of build the UI which we see displayed on screen using the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. There's no HTML of any sort of substance right now, which we can see defined in this file. Everything we're going to eventually go on to see in the browser is going to be generated from our functional components from inside the React app, if we wish. And we've got an example of our first component here in app.jsx. So for those unfamiliar with React, we can define our components to have an extension .jsx, and we've got this app.jsx. And although on line 6, what looks like HTML is actually known as JavaScript XML. And I've defined in resources.jsx just a little file which should explain that in a little bit better detail. So an example of JSX here, we've got hello world. It looks like standard HTML. JSX is actually what we sort of describe as syntactic sugar that helps us basically write HTML-like code more easily in JavaScript. As we can see how we'd write it, just using sort of vanilla JavaScript and React below. So this is how JSX will eventually resolve. It'll resolve as vanilla JavaScript and use the React sort of library which we've imported, and that will be converted into genuine HTML and then added to the DOM, which we will then see in the browser ourselves. All we really need to understand is that all of our HTML-like code under the hood in our React component is essentially JavaScript. So there's a few stages to go through with a React app before HTML is displaying in the browser. So the browser has to receive an empty HTML file, which we can see if I sort of split my screen just now. It receives an empty HTML file. The browser doesn't understand JSX, so it's first compiled by a tool like Babel during the build process. And for, I know, students who've gone through the Fosse course, you'd have used sort of like Vite to sort of convert, to make that bundling conversion, and we'll use different tools today. And then when we load the app, this then creates the UI in the browser by processing JavaScript and manipulating the DOM. Ultimately, the UI is built in the client after React has been executed, which isn't good for performance. So you receive the files, but before you see anything, the browser is going to have to process all the HTML, CSS to JSX, turn it into JavaScript, which then updates it into actual readable HTML on the window. So applications built in React, which are JavaScript heavy, may also lead to poor SEO performance, which is another reason why Next.js is a really popular tool. So search engines like Google will use automated scripts or bots, and they'll basically trawl through websites and they'll have access to the HTML in a page, and they'll basically use that to rank websites when someone does Google search. Say, is this website sort of displaying content which is relevant to the search that you've made? And bots typically prefer HTML because it's easier to parse, it requires less complicated scripting. How this links to us is that it becomes more difficult for bots to access our websites and the content on the websites if they're really heavily dependent on JavaScript. If a bot got access to our website right now, well, the HTML doesn't tell us anything about the site. We have a title tag which says React session, but the actual content, what this site displays to the user, it's non-existent. It would have to go through the stages of actually, executing that React application to see anything of any substance. So one of the ways which Next.js is used is basically to process the JSX on the server. So the React components are rendered to HTML before that is sent to the client. So the browser then actually receives a fully formed HTML page, essentially giving users quicker load times and also allowing bots to access content and index web pages more easily. So Next.js is going to be something which you progress onto following this site. Our focus today is going to be on sort of getting up to speed with React, and then hopefully we're going to hit next hour or so. And then we'll actually sort of build the React application, and then we'll get it ready so you can actually sort of apply Next.js to it, which can be quite interesting. So let's start exploring this repository in a little bit more detail. As we initially saw, we've got this package.json file. This contains all the dependencies. We have a script right now we can execute, script called build. It executes Webpack. In the dependencies, we've got React and React DOM. We also have several dev dependencies which relate to Babel and Webpack. For those who aren't familiar with these dependencies, you may see them quite frequently. If you're doing front-end or software development, Babel is added to convert JSS syntax and also convert modern JavaScript syntax into older versions so that it's compatible with older browsers. Things like sort of arrow functions, if you're familiar with JavaScript, using let, const, star are fairly recent additions to JavaScript. Older browsers don't necessarily understand what they are. So you use a tool like Babel to basically convert all your variables you're defining with let and const over to var. Not a problem you have with Python. I saw you looking at that the other day. We also have a configuration file .babelrc, and this basically is there to show you how we use Babel. So Babel, the dev dependency present end, is transpiles modern JavaScript, and I added a comment for preset React, and that's basically converting JSX into the vanilla JavaScript, which you can use in conjunction with the React library. We also have Webpack as one of our dev dependencies, which is a bundler, and that's basically taking all of our JavaScript files, our style sheets, our images, and bundling them into a single file, which can then be served to the browser. And we do also have another configuration file for Webpack as well. So you can see at the top here, we're basically grabbing our JavaScript from the entry point, from the source index, which we can see, which is this file right here. I won't open it up just now. And it's basically going to bundle everything which has the extension JavaScript or JSX for React, and basically use the Babel loader to achieve this, which is another dependency, and then output it to a file called bundle.js in a directory called dist. You don't necessarily need to sort of take this memory and sort of really solidify it. It's just boilerplate, which will be sort of the starting point for a lot of React applications. We also will have CSS in this React application, which is for styling. And we'll see that we also have a style loader and a CSS loader, which will basically help us, again, bundle our CSS so we can all link it through that bundle.js file right now. Cool. And yeah, so we take everything from index.js and we put it all into our bundle.js file. This is a boilerplate, as I said, of what a lot of React applications look like when you start off. We have an index.html file. That index.html file with a div inside that links to I'll bring it over this side, an index.js file. And in that index.js file, we grab the roots from that HTML, get element by ID root. And then what we do with that root, save to the variable root, we render our first React component, and that is going to be app.jsx, which again, if I bring over to this right-hand side of the screen, we've got this three-step process. Let's actually run our script to try and bundle our code together. So I'll execute it. We'll run npm run build, which is the name of our script. If you downloaded Node, you should also have access to npm through that download. And one of the things you should notice is that we've got this dist folder, which is now being created, and it now contains our bundle.js file. So that's the file which you can see we've linked inside our index.html. So this HTML is going to process the bundled code, and we should be able to see the contents of our application. So if I load this up again, we now have this beautiful Hello World application, which is marvelous. I think you'll agree. And that's a little bit, what the problem is. For us to see anything rendered in the browser, we had to go through these different stages of actually, pulling in the source code, the JavaScript files. We have to build our React application, transpile the JSX and the JavaScript, use the JavaScript to actually build our HTML elements, and then display it on the screen. And that's sort of some of the performance issues which Next.js really goes on to help us resolve. Cool. So that's the basics of a simple React application. Let's move on to actually working with React a little bit more to expand the application a little bit. Right now, there's a very simple program, as you can see. So app.jsx, let me close all this down, is our only component so far. And for those familiar with JavaScript, we can see the file is essentially an arrow function with an export at the bottom. If you've used JavaScript before and you're used to seeing module.exports instead of exports, it's because we're not using CommonJS anymore, but ECMAScript, which is natively supported in browsers. But anyway, contained within the return code block between lines 5 and 7, this is basically what we wish to be visible inside our UI. So this is our JSX, the heading H1 Hello World. Again, we can see that in the browser being displayed right there. There's space between the function name and then the return block of code to handle logic, other functions, or any states. We want this component to hold. And we'll see examples of this in a moment when we go in to build more components. So yesterday I was planning out this session and I decided that we're going to build an application which relates to professional cycling. I enjoy my cycling, but I want to find a React application or build a React application which details cyclists, their name, what team they ride for, the type of cyclist they are and what they've won. If I wasn't talking to you about React today, I'd much like to think I'll be a professional cyclist on the Tour de France. Life took a different turn for me. So here I am talking about React instead, which is still very much enjoyable. So I want to make use of CDD or component-driven design, which will basically help us separate out the responsibilities of each areas of our application. So it should help us program more quickly because we can reuse components as we create them as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the heading in app.js X to reflect our new application. So what I'm going to do is change the heading from Hello World. I'm going to change this to London. Let's go for 42 London cyclists. And I've not enabled hot reloading on this. So what we will have to do actually, if we do want to see those changes come through, we'll have to execute our script again. But we can see that change is now carried over into the browser as well. So let's actually go ahead and add our cyclists. Now we want to avoid adding our JSX or HTML lookalike code into app.jsx directly, but we want to define a component instead so we can reuse that several times and speed up the process of building out this React app. Sorry, the lights in my room have just gone off, so let me just quickly stand up and make sure trigger those lights again. So what I'm going to do is cd in the terminal over to the source folder, and I'm going to make a new folder inside that folder called components. And then I'm going to cd inside. From components, I'm going to create a file index.js, and then I'm also going to make our first component, which is called cyclist. We'll use index.js to export all of our components and the component itself called cyclist. One thing to note at this stage, if you aren't familiar with using React or HTML, it's important for us to capitalize our components. So if I expand this component file now, we can see that capitalist uses a capital C. Again, if we look inside let me close down this component, our index.jsx, and open the HTML to the side, we're going to see that HTML is using lowercase tag names, like with div here, lowercase t. What separates out sort of the HTML tags and our React components is that this is going to be capitalized. And that's just as beneficial for us as developers as it will be for React itself actually processing the declarative commands which we're giving to it through these scripts. So something to bear in mind. But inside cyclist, let's minimize that and just keep things as tidy as possible. Inside cyclist, we've got index.css. And what we want to do actually is cd into cyclist this time. So we're going to give it an index.jsx file, which will be the component itself, the code, which pertains to it. And we're also going to define a CSS file, which relates specifically to that component. So we're going to put it in the same file. If we wanted to, this could also be where we define a testing file for the components. And that's, again, another benefit of React is all of our components can live in isolation. So we can also test them in isolation. So you can get it's much easier to test a React application than it is to test an application using vanilla JavaScript on the front end, in my experience anyway. Cool. So we're starting to build out a project structure for application. If I expand our cyclists folder inside the components folder, again, this index.jsx file is going to be where we actually define the components for our cyclists. I have an extension in my VS Code, which is, if I can find it, E7 plus React Redux, React Native snippets. It's not something you need to add yourself, but it can be quite helpful if you're using React fairly often. So if I just punch in RAFCE, that's basically an acronym for React Arrow Functional Component with an export. If I then hit tab, that will auto-generate the basics of a React application, or React component, sorry, for us to then tap into and sort of expand as we see fit. It will save you, I guess, 20 seconds every time you define a new component. If you're defining components regularly, those 20 seconds can add up and accumulate quite nicely. So what I'll do, I'll just change the name from index to cyclist. Index was generated from the file name which we ran it on, and this file name is called index.jsx. So I'll just update that. So we've got cyclist there, which is what the name of the component is. It's important that the function name and the function name I've defined here on line 3 and the export name on line 9 are the same, as export defaults will only export a single value from a file or a module. We'll see sort of us exporting sort of name functionalities later on, but from this module, we want to export one thing, so we're using export default, and what we're exporting in this functional component, which is currently contained between lines 3 and 7. So let's go ahead and actually build out some aspects of our components. The first thing I'm going to do is replace our div with what's known as a fragment. Let me close that off. React requires that each component only return one parent element from the component. So what we couldn't do, hypothetically, is have a div with a hello world sort of content, and then underneath return a p tag with something saying goodbye. The reason it doesn't like that is because there's two parent elements being returned within this component. If I wrapped those two elements within a fragment, the errors would go away. An additional benefit of using fragments and not a div or a p tag is that it doesn't sort of by default add any styling to the application, which we may not necessarily want. We can use divs, we can use semantic elements as well, if that's something which is going to be beneficial to the application. But if you want to avoid adding any unnecessary markup, this is an option we have. Let's go ahead and add some markup within this component. And what I'm going to do is define several p tags. Let's go back there. I'm going to give them a class name. Again, if you are familiar with just using HTML, you may sort of be questioning at this point, why have you put class name when it's just class? Well, class is a keyword in JavaScript, and essentially what we're doing is programming in JavaScript right now in JSX, so we can't use class because that's what we do OOP in JavaScript, so we have to use class name instead. And then what I'm going to do is just duplicate this several times so we can go back and actually define this class a bit more. So the first p tag is going to have a class name of rider, then it's going to be team, and we're going to use these classes in the JSX and to style, to grab with CSS later on, so we can actually make our website look semi-decent. I promise you, it's not going to look beautiful, but it will look sort of better than it could have been if we don't do any of this. And then what I'm going to do is just add in some, again, some generic content. So when we actually render this on the screen, we can see what this information kind of relates to. And again, what we're doing is tracking different cyclists who completed the Tour de France, and we're basically seeing how many Tour de France stages have they won, their age, and other bits of information, which is arguable about how interesting it really is, unless you are a cycling fan. Cool. So we've not added any information right now. We've not even sort of like rendered this component. This is living in isolation. To display this component as it currently is in the browser, we need to export it again from the index.js file. So we'll bring this up over here. And then we need to import it into our app.jsx. So right now, if you see this file structure, we've got an index.jsx file, which lives inside the cyclist folder, which is going to be sort of our overarching component. And that cyclist folder is living inside a components folder where we have this index.js file right now. So what I want to do is export from this location. And what I'm going to do is take the default export, and maybe if I write it back to front, it'll make more sense. Find the default export from the cyclist folder, and then we're going to rename that default export as cyclist, so we're consistent in our naming conventions across this application. So when we use bundlers like Webpack, what it'll do, it'll look for a file called index. So basically what we're doing is grabbing the default export from the index file inside our cyclist folder. We're naming the export cyclists. You'll see here in between the curly braces. And then we're exporting it from the components folder as a named export, so you can access this from the app.jsx. So now if I go back into my parent component, what we can do is import this component into app.jsx. So again, I'm importing from the components folder. And in that components folder, it's automatically looking for a file called index.jsx. And from that file, index.jsx, we're going to destructure an export called cyclists. And we don't necessarily have to do it this way, but sort of like planning your application where you are using a separate index.js file to export all of your components, it allows you to make all your imports on one line of code. Imagine if we were making an application which was sort of much broader in scope, where we had components relating to cyclists, had components relating to footballers, to singers, to, I don't know, baseballers. We can achieve all of that on one line, and what we'd have to do is sort of duplicate this line of code in index.js several times, where we export default as footballers from footballer. The alternative would be that we have a line of code very similar to this. We could have that several times, and then our components are going to look messy, they're going to be hard to work with. So if we can limit that earlier on, that's a really advantageous step that we can take. So we've imported this component now. Now we just need to render it. And what I'll do is underneath the H1, I will render that component, and it will look very much like a self-closing HTML tag, but it's not, it's JSX. There is one issue we have right now. We've got this red squiggles indicating that sort of not everything is well in the world of React. Does anyone know what the problem we have with this component is right now? And it relates similar to what we discussed in our cycling components. Let me go to the chat. I think I heard something posted in. Yep, definitely, you're spot on. The problem is we're trying to return 2 elements at the parent level from this app.jsx right now. And remember that our React components, all they need is to be returned one parent element at the top. And then it doesn't matter sort of how complicated the children elements are. But on the high level, on the top level, sorry, we just need one parent element. So let me go ahead and do that right now. And that should resolve some of the issues which we had earlier on. Cool. Is that a question I can see? Or does someone come off mute? All right. Do shout out if there are any questions as well. Cool. So let's go ahead and actually try and build this application again to see what those changes look like, to see if we can actually render the application in the browser. So I'll CD back to the level where we have this package.json file, and then I'll have to execute our script again, npm run build. And wait for that to build. What we should see is something much more impressive than that. Let me try that again. What we should have hopefully seen is this cyclist come through, and I can see the issue I've made right now. Because what I've done in app.jsx is I've imported a file or some functionality called cyclists from components. But as you can see in this file, we've actually not exported anything called cyclists. We've only exported cyclists. So if I correct that typo and then we rebuild, that should hopefully get us back to where we was expecting. And let me just open up this HTML file once again in the browser, and we should see, cool, our component for cyclist rendered. And right now, as you see, there's no information contained inside this component. We've just got empty HTML for the cyclist team, type of rider, age, and the amount of Tour de France stage wins we've got, which again relates to this component we've defined in cyclist right now, and we've rendered as a child component to cyclist. So as you can see, we've nested one component inside another, and this is something we should be doing. Instead of just having a folder called components, what I recommend you going on to have is folders for layouts and pages as well. Pages could be where we define components for pages of an application, which we can navigate to and from. Think of your About Us page, your product page, whatever it may be. Layouts can contain components which hold significant areas of a page, and maybe displaying the results from the page, a navigation section, a footer. Then our components folder, which is what we've defined, are the small building blocks which make up those larger features. And together, you will have pages, layout, and components to build really complex and interesting UIs. All of these components, can then live inside each other, and we describe them as having that parent-child relationship. And this is an important feature of React. Let me just take a swig of water in quickly. So, like parent-child relationships, things can be passed from the parent to the child. My mum, for instance, gave me curly hair. I, however, cannot give my mum my love for Warhammer 40k, nor can I give my mum my love for Lord of the Rings. There's sort of a unidirectional flow of sort of inheritance, if you wish. Our components behave in a similar way. Through something called props, from a parent, we can give children access to different pieces of information. In our case, our app.jsx, which we can see on the left-hand side of the screen, is the parent app to cyclist, which is contained inside it. Our cyclist component is currently missing information, as we can see, about their name, their team, the type of cyclist they are, their age, and the Tour de France wins. And instead of hard coding that information, now I could quite easily say Emile Sherrott, and that would, which is my name, and I have no problem being rendered on the page right now. But instead of that, let's pass in that information from the parent, so then this component becomes reusable and we can use it again and again and again. So the way we pass in information, as we've sort of alluded to, is through a process called props. And what we do, we give in key value pairs where we give the key of name and then in curly braces, we'll pass in the value which to assign to that. So I'm going to pick the latest winner of the Tour de France, a cyclist called Tadej Pogačar, who is really cool. And I can tell you, because I Googled this yesterday evening, that he, I knew this one. He rides for a team UAE. The type of cyclist he is a GC or general classification. And then he is currently 26 years old. And he has 17 Tour de France stage wins. And what have I done wrong there? Use a closing parentheses when I should be using a closing curly brace. So we've got key value pairs. These will be passed on to the child components as part of a props object, which will contain those keys, the keys of, as you can see, name, team, type, age, and Tour de France, which is just, I guess, a shortened version of Tour de France stage wins, which I've chosen myself. And what we do is we wrap those values in curly braces, and then they're then interpreted as within the JavaScript. So as you can see, we've got strings, we've got integers, numbers as JavaScript will describe it as. And then what we can do inside our child component, which they've been passed into, we can treat these values similar to how we treat parameters of the function. What we'll commonly do inside the parentheses of that function is destructure from that props object. So in this case, what we can do is basically pull out the name, the team, the type of cyclist they are, the age, and the amount of Tour de France stage wins. If you're looking at documentation online, you may see people sort of use a different convention where they don't destructure. And what they'll do instead is call the props object directly and then use some form of dot notation, square bracket notation for access to keys on that object. Again, I think destructuring is a slightly nicer, cleaner syntax to be able to achieve the same thing. So what I need to do now is actually insert dynamically these pieces of information into the JSX of this component. So what I can do, again, is stipulate curly braces to define JavaScript, and then we can just inject the name here. And then what we're going to go for is the team, and then just pass in the information. And this looks very similar to string interpolation. I saw you use F strings in Python the other day. In JavaScript, you'd use backticks, and then you can use sort of dollar symbols and curly braces in JSX to sort of insert variables into content. We just need to use these curly braces, and then we can pass those in. So that's quite a nice syntax for us to use. So let us do that for the type, and we'll continue doing the same thing with age and also with the amount of Tour de France stage wins. So I'll give that a save. And again, if I've not made any spelling mistakes, if we run npm run build one more time, what we should be able to see is that being built and then the information now being rendered inside our application, which we can view, admire, love, whatever you want to do with your React applications. So this is a very simple example of a component, a nested component, a child component. But what we're able to do now is reuse this component quickly and quite effectively. So one cyclist doesn't make a grand tour, and Tadej Pogačar, he needs competition to excel. It's what makes him a great, the competition he beats. Fortunately for us, this becomes a really simple process now for us to sort of replicate the component we currently have. So what I can do is just copy this component several times, and then all I can do is replace this information inside the components. So Tadej Pogačar's big rival at the Tour de France these days is another cyclist called Jonas Vingegaard. He rides for the team Visma Bike. He's also a GC, which makes it quite easy. He's a bit older than Tadej Pogačar. I think he's won 4 stages, but I think he's won 2 Tour de France yellow jerseys. Tadej Pogačar's won 3. Anyway, I'll go for Mark Cavendish. For those who don't know, he is the Manx missile. He's recently retired from professional cycling, but this year he broke the record for the most stage wins in Tour de France history, beating the great Eddie Merckx. And he's 39, and he won his 35th Tour de France stage. Obviously, if you're coding along, you don't need to copy the examples. And then I gave up trying to Google all the different cyclists which I like, and I just included myself. So for today, I'm going to be Team 42 London. I'm going to be a climber because I think that's a very romantic type of cyclist to be. I'm 32, unfortunately, and I have run 0 Tour de France's for now. That may change when we introduce states into our application. So we've expanded this quite quickly, actually, now. It took us maybe 30 minutes to get this initial setup done, but now we're here. We can replicate this fairly cheaply. So if I run npm build again, what we should be able to see is that component being sort of duplicated the 4 times, containing this different information about Mark Cavendish, about Jonas Vingegaard, and then about myself quite poorly at the bottom. So it's pretty ugly, but the point I want to get across is that once we've defined one component, it becomes fairly easy for us to reuse it and build applications of scale quite quickly. What I'll do is tidy things up a little bit. And again, if you're actually building your React applications when you're making API requests as well, what ordinarily you'll do is you'll receive an array of data into this file. And then instead of sort of even manually coding out your different components, you'd iterate, you'd map through that array of data, and then you'd replicate a component for every single data point in that array. Like imagine if you go onto Amazon and you search for, I don't know, televisions, and Amazon will have an API which retains all the information on the television. It's made by Sony, how wide it is, and all sort of consists. It all fits into a consistent sort of pattern of data where you have keys like name, team, type, age, Tour de France, but brands, cost, whatever data you care about for a TV, and you just iterate over it and then display all the TVs on your website, which is again I find quite interesting. But let's tidy things up a little bit. So as I showed you earlier, we have this cyclist.css file which relates to our cycling component. So what I'm going to do is define some CSS really quickly. I'm going to target a class called cyclist, which I've not defined yet. I'm going to give it box sizing, border box, which is basically there to make sure that the content, the padding, margin, border, which we define on our HTML elements, sort of all pertain to the explicitly defined width of a element we define. And then I'm going to give it a border. It can be 1 pixel. It's going to be a solid border. I'm going to use the hex code of black, which is going to be 000. I'm going to display it as flex. If you're not familiar with the CSS I'm writing, display flex is basically a way for us to sort of organize different elements on the page. What this is basically going to do is make sure that you see in our page right now that our 4 cyclists are in block scope. And what that basically means is that they fall one underneath the other. What I want to do is make them sort of flow horizontally instead. So sort of changing the display properties of this class will help us achieve that. So I'm going to do flex direction, and I'm going to go for column. And then what I'm going to do is align items center. I'm going to give it a width of 30%. And then the margin, which is going to be the space between the elements and other elements on the page, I'm going to give it 20 pixels. Again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly just because it doesn't really pertain to React, but I want the application to look semi-presentable as we go through it. And then we've got the class of rider. What I'm going to do is give that a font size, really basic, of large. And then we're going to have a class of name, which we've not yet defined. I'm just going to give this a font weight of bold. Why not? Cool. So then what I need to do inside our cyclist components is actually import it. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Generally, we'll keep all of it imports at the top of the page. So what I'll do is just import, and then we just need to pass in the relative path to that file. And that's going to be spelled properly, cyclist.css. The only thing we need to do now is actually, we've defined the class called cyclist. That doesn't exist anywhere. in our application right now. So I'm actually going to go back and change these fragments into an actual div, and then I can give it the class name of cyclist. Let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to change that into a div as well. And then the only other things we need to add, rider details, which is going to be applied to all of our p tags. So I'll sort of do this a bit quickly and pass in rider details to all of these. And everything with the class rider details will then inherit that font family, the monospace font we've assigned it. And then the last thing actually I want to do is give this a span, and we'll have the name inside that span. And then I will give that span a class name of name. And as we can see, all that's going to do is make the name we display on the screen in bold, a bit more visible, and it's going to command a little bit more interest over the other areas of our application. That by itself won't look too special. What we need to do is actually go back to our source folder. Where am I looking? Next, let's make sure we're in the right place. And then if we go into source, what I'm going to do is now create some CSS, which is going to pertain to the parent components. So let's close all that down, keep our workspace nice and tidy. And then we've got app.css, and all I'm going to do is give the element of the ID of heading, some styling. I'm going to center the text, and then I'm also going to give it another font family, and that font family is going to be a sans serif font family, which should look fairly good. And then all I'm going to do is define a section. I'm going to display this as flex as well, so it flows across the page. And then I'm going to use another property in this CSS declaration called flex wrap, and that's basically going to detail because each of our child components are being asked to occupy 30% width of the page. Once that 100% width of the max page is occupied, what do we do? Do we scroll off the page to the right-hand side, or do we sort of, I guess, wrap underneath? And we're sort of defining that behavior to wrap. And then lastly, just to get this all done, what I'm going to do is import again our app.css. And now we need to add in our ID of heading and our section. So our ID of heading is going to go on the H1. And then lastly, I'm just going to add in this section. Let's drag that down to the bottom. Prettier. Nice. Okay, so we've done a lot right there relating to the styling. Let's make sure that that is actually working as we expect. We'll build it again. Cool. So now it looks slightly better. We've displayed the information on the page, a bit more visually pleasing for any of our users. And again, this is still quite a limited example to using components in React. We've got one component with child component app with the child cyclist. We may get to sort of a stage where we have hundreds of components which are sort of nested multiple childs deep. We have to introduce tools like Redux or use context to sort of pass data between them a bit more efficiently. But this is a very limited example around different cyclists. I appreciate we've been going for a little while. Are there any questions at this point about anything we've covered? If so, feel free to shout out, feel free to pop them in the chat. I don't mind whatsoever.
Emile, thank you for this section. I have one question.
Please.
Actually, could you please tell us more about how to make a component separate, because you create the cyclist component, and maybe how actually components work if we take like component cyclists and component bicycle and add on app page to those different components and how they interact on each other. What I try to ask about children.
Yeah, so I mean, in this point right now, our main parent component is app.jsx, which is a very standard sort of like, you know, parent component to have. Is what you'll see on most React applications before we actually get to Next.js, and then this will sort of flip on its head completely. But yeah, I mean, if I understand your question correctly, we have the cyclist component here, which we've imported into this module, and we've rendered it 4 different times. And each component is basically going to be there it will be independent from the cyclist component, which has the name Pikachu, which will be entirely independent from the cyclist component with the name Jonas Vingegaard, Mark Cavendish, Emile Sherrott. They're designed using sort of JavaScript functions, so they have sort of similar behavior, so they can be replicated, tested, modularized really sort of quickly, really efficiently, but they sort of all hold their own independent state. We haven't looked at it right now, but when we get on to use sort of one of some React hooks, we'll be using useState, we'll see that they actually sort of hold their own information independently, and they sort of like, you know, perform different functions independently as well. In terms of like how many sort of children we can nest our components in, we can go really deep. You know, I've seen applications which are built in React, and you'll have, you know, not talking about a parent and a child, we'll have a parent and great grandchildren to the head level. And this actually becomes really more important as we start using Next.js, because Next.js, and we'll come to this in a little moment actually, but because Next.js really, you need to specify different types of children components which will be built in the server and the components which are then built in the client. Actually, the modularity and how sort of small we can define our components actually becomes really intricate. We should be sort of building children components, which could be a simple button. We could be defining components which can be sort of on that small level. Earlier when I spoke about having sort of folders which pertain to the pages, to the layouts. And then in this case, actually, our cyclist component starts looking quite big, where our components folder will eventually be holding sort of like, you know, these great grandchildren of components, which I said are essentially just buttons, are essentially just links in the navigation bar. And it seems like if you've, before you come to this session and you've done any sort of work in just HTML, and you think, well, actually, you know, a navigation bar is just a list item on an ordered list, making its own component for that, where you've got importing React and importing CSS, importing different props from the function arrow function, and then defining all this different sort of you know, JavaScript to write just simply what could be a li. It seems like overkill, but sort of when you sort of define all these relationships between the UI, you do create applications which are greater than the sum of its parts. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Maybe I got a bit carried away. But yeah, there's some of the ways different components live inside each other. We'll see that in a little bit actually, because right now we're going to move on to some more complicated data. So right now, to pass information between our parent app to our child cyclist, we've been using props. What we should do is transition to actual states instead. And state allows us to track data, which ultimately can change over time. And we can use that state to update the UI as well. If you were to continue looking into React beyond this session, it'll play a huge role in creating more interactive and more dynamic applications. Generally, when we're interacting with states, we're using hooks. And hooks are special pieces of React functionality that help us manage states. I'm just going to show you useState today. I'd recommend, if you do have more time, taking a look at useEffects, which will basically make fetching data and making API calls really interesting, really easy. Use Navigate is something which we look at as well. and you can navigate to other pages on a website, other areas of the website, and use contexts and use reducer, which is basically going to allow you to handle more complicated states. We're not going to be dealing with any massively complicated states today in this session. But useState is a React hook, and it basically returns an element, an array, with 2 elements. The first element is going to be the current state, and then the second element is going to be a function to actually update that state. So we get access to the hook from the React import at the top of our screen, this import on line 1. And what we're going to do is actually import useState into our cyclist component. So again, the index.jsx file, which lives in source component cyclist index.jsx. So what I'm going to do is input a comma and then use square brackets and import useState. And actually, if I go back, what you should be able to see is all the different hooks we have access to, and they all sort of, follow this pattern of use and then something else. Sorry if my voice is a little hoarse. I've just recovered from a little bit of flu the past few days, so still sort of recovering from that. I can start hearing myself being a bit nasally. But anyway, sort of to use this hook useState, what we need to do is destructure our 2 array elements from the functionality useState itself. And again, remember useState is an array with 2 elements in it. So what we'll do is define that underneath the function name cyclist, so below line 4 and above the return block of code. And the first state, as we said, is going to be the first element of this array, which we destructure, is actually going to be the state, and we can choose the name which we want to provide. So what we're going to do is give some state for the stage wins instead of using this PDF, which doesn't really mean too much at this point in time. The second element of the array, as I said, is going to be the function to update the state. Now, commonly, we'll use camel case in JavaScript, and the convention is just to append set before the name of the previous state. So our state is called stage wins. So the function conventionally we'll just call it set stage wins using camel case. And then what we need to do is actually destructure this functionality from useState. And then in useState, as it is functionality, we have some parentheses. And then in the parentheses, what we need to do is pass in the initial value of that state. So what I'm going to do is we've already destructured the values from TDF into this child component. So if we're assuming right now, if we're sort of being very singular, TDF holds the value of 17. So we can dynamically insert that into our useState. So stage wins then carries that value of 17 all the way through to this React component state. So now we're in a position where we can use state, and all I'll do is change the value on TDF, and then we can change TDF to stage wins. I'm not going to build that again. If everything has gone well, we'll be able to see no difference in that. But the flow would be that we've defined this child component cyclist. And then what we do is we pass onto the props key of TDF, the value 17. That destructured key, TDF, is then passed into the initial state of stage wins. And then we render that stage wins instead of the prop as the value next the amount of Tour de France stages, Tele Catchers won. And then actually, if I go back to the React component which we defined, that should remain the same. We'll see that in a little bit when we try and build it one more time. The point I want to get to here is where we can basically update the amount of stage wins for any of our tour riders. And ultimately, what I want to do is give Emile Sherrott a stage win, because right now I'm on 0, and that's looking pretty sad, if you don't mind me saying, compared to all these greats of the cycling game. But again, what I want to do is actually create a new component to handle this. If we break down our components, this is a key principle in React. It will help you when you go on to look into Next.js later on. When we render some components on the client, or we render some components on the server, the more we break it down, the more small they are, the more focused they are. It makes them easier to maintain. It makes them easier to test. It also makes them easier to reuse. So what I'm going to do is cd into source, and then what I'm going to do is go, even further into components, and then I'm going to make a new component called button. And inside button, I'm going to touch the same files, index.jsx, and an accompanying CSS file so we can style it, button.css. So let's go into our button component and then define how we want that to behave. Again, I'm going to use CE to give our templates. And then actually let me rename everything to button. I'll go ahead this time and import button directly onto the component. And then instead of having a div called button, there's a HTML element called button, which will probably be more appropriate for what we're trying to build. And then the content of that button will be add stage win. And when we click this button, what we hope it'll do is we'll actually add a stage win to the UI. So we can see that coming through. Cool. Really quickly, and this shouldn't take long, I'm just going to give this button some styling as well. Let me close those node modules. I'm going to target an element with the name button. I'm going to give it a background color of yellow. Bonus points for anyone who knows the hex code of yellow off the top of their head. I think it's FF0, yep. Yellow is the color of the Tour de France. And then what I'm going to do is give it a border as well. It's going to be 1 pixel solid, and it's going to be black. If you've not used hex codes before, it's basically base 16, sort of the amounts of red, green, and blue. So what we're saying here is that yellow is going to be sort of full amounts of red, full amounts of green, no blue. So the absence of color black is going to be 0, 0, 0. Border radius, we're going to give it nice curved edges to the button, and then we're going to give it some padding, separating the content add stage win to the border, and then we're going to give it some margin, separating it from other elements on this page. Cool. So to display this on each of our cyclist components, what do we need to do now? Well, we've exported it. We now need to import it. We could choose, if we wished, to export it the same way, which we've done now. And generally, I think that is the prevailing wisdom. I think we're going to do it slightly differently, just because I want to show you that you don't have to do it that way, especially if you're working with a small application. It may be overkill for what you're trying to achieve. But we want to import this into our cyclist component. So this is going to be a grandchild of our app component. And what we want to do is have the button displayed at the bottom of, this information about each cyclist. So we'll have the ability to add on to their Tour de France stage wins. So what I'm going to do is, again, at the top of the page, generally I like to structure my modules so you have imports from React or our dependencies at the top. And then what we'll do is import our React components, which we've defined ourselves underneath that. And then further beneath that, we'll actually have the CSS which relates to the application. So let's go back one level and we'll import button. And again, we just need to render this into the component now. And what we'll do is, again, what looks like a capitalized self-closing HTML tag, render the button. Cool. Now the moment of truth. I just need to cd back, I think it's 2 levels, to where we have the package.json and where our script lives inside that package.json, and then run npm run build. Cool. And what we should hopefully see is nice. We've defined the button. We've added it to each cyclist component. That cyclist component is being rendered 4 times by its parent component app. So we can see this add stage win button in yellow defines 4 times onto our UI. Right now, no matter how ferociously I click for Emile Sherrott to add a stage win to get 0 off the ground to 1. It's not going to do anything because we've not actually added any functionality to it at this point in time. But again, the fact that we have used component-driven design, we're able to scale this, we're able to add features really quickly and duplicate this across sites fairly rapidly. Again, if this were to be like an Amazon, site equivalent using React, imagine that this button was add to wish list, add to baskets. We program it once for a component, and then we can add it to a parent component. We can replicate that across an entire data set, which Amazon has on its products. And then you're laughing. And hopefully they have a better stylus than what I've showed you today. Cool. But yeah, this button's not working. What I want to do now is basically just add the ability to update our states for stage wins. We are using state again. Remember that we replaced, if I find it really quickly, we replaced TDF from the props with the state from new stage wins. So let's actually, go ahead and actually pass another prop to our button. Now, in app, if I show you really quickly, we're passing in primitive data types. We're passing in strings. We're passing in integers. We can pass in more if we wish. We've got a function here, set stage wins, which we can also pass as a prop into a child component. So what I'll do is give it the key name, set stage wins, and I'll also notice how it's still grayed and muted in color. We've not actually targeted it yet. And then we'll also give it the value of that functionality, set stage wins. Now it's white, it's vibrant. So we're actually going to pass that functionality into the button component, which we want to use to actually infect update states. Remember, our stage wins is what we're using in the cyclist component to display how many stage wins. Sorry, wrong. That's the replication. We're using the stage wins to display how many wins a cyclist has to the Tour de France. But then the second item in the array is a function to update that state, which we're going to pass into the button. Because ultimately, when we click on this button, we want to update the stage wins any given cyclist has won. So let's go into our button, which is on the right-hand side of my screen. It's been passed in as a prop. And what I want to do now is destructure it like we did before. So what I want to do is just name that functionality, set stage wins. And then what I'm going to do is actually define a function. And that function, which is going to be called on an event listener, and that's going to trigger this function. So what I'm going to do is write a function called handle click. It's going to be an arrow function, and that is not how you write arrow functions. Let's make that a little bit better. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to use our useState function. And what happens is that it automatically receives the previous state's value as the argument we pass into the parentheses. Let me make sure I spell that correctly. So any argument we pass in, that's going to be the value of the previous sort of version of the state. React components, when their state is updated, they get re-rendered, and you can look quite interestingly at the life cycle of React components, which we're not going to have time for today. But essentially, if we refer to the previous value of the state, it becomes quite safe as a way to update that state if we just use the previous version and then we add one. It's a good idea to refer to the previous state rather than, you may see applications which actually class in the prop for the state as well, which, I'm going to write just to undo actually, because it's a mistake I wouldn't want anyone to make. And then instead, they'll do stage wins plus one. And this looks fine. All you're saying is that update the state of stage wins to the current value of stage wins plus one. The issue you have with that is when some state updates become asynchronous, and by the time it takes for a React component to be re-rendered onto a UI, this, by the time this function's had time to execute, it gets lost in this loop of being re-rendered, and then you get inconsistent values. So the guiding sort of advice on this is to, again, refer to the previous value of the state and then perform any action you want on it. And right now, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, this is an example of an anonymous arrow function, very similar to this named arrow function, const button, and we pass in, I guess, our parameters. Here, all we're doing is doing the same thing, a function which basically returns the value of the previous value +1 to the set stage wins function. This is quite complicated stuff. I know we've got some of my former students on the call, and this is something where we spend around like 4 days with looking at React. We cover sort of different things about routing in React. We cover different things about sort of Redux, which is handling sort of state globally, where we sort of transition away from props. So this is a very sort of like quick introduction to how React works before you move on to actually applying this with Next.js as well. So we've got this function, handle click. All it's doing is basically taking the value, in this case, the value of 0. When I click it, I want to take that 0, will be passed in as prev, we'll add 1 to it, and we'll return it to this function. So hopefully it becomes 1. This function handle click, again, is gray and muted. It's not being called anywhere. In React, we have event listeners. If you're using vanilla JavaScript, you will have like sort of, attached to an element, add event listener, first argument, the types of events. All the events are very similar, but they'll have the pattern of on beforehand, the same way React uses use state in terms of their naming convention for their hooks. React will use on, and then what name the event we're listening for, that's going to be on click. And then what we need to do is basically pass in the function which we want to call when a click is handled, and that's going to be handle click. Cool. So this change, when applied, the state of the parent, this change is then going to be applied to the state in the parent component, and cyclists should hopefully reflect that in the UI when this event is triggered. And earlier I said that I could inherit my mum's curly hair, but my mum can't inherit my love for 140K. So you may be in a situation right now where you're sort of seeing the screen, you're saying, well, actually, this is the child components here, and it's going to be updating elements of the parent components. And that's a very good question. Now, although React does use unidirectional data flow from parent to child, a child component can signal changes back to parents using callback functions, which is why this works. And maybe an example would be, my mum wasn't an Arsenal fan. I am an Arsenal fan. I took my mum to an Arsenal game last weekend, and she is an Arsenal fan, so I may be able to influence her where I'm not actually able to give her specific characteristics. Anyway, let's see if this works. So I'll do npm run build. Hopefully for the final time, we can see that it's been built successfully, and awesome. I'm not sure if you can see. If I zoom in ever so slightly, where am I? You can see that now when I click, I can update the amount of Tour de France stage wins Emile Sherrott has won. 42 London is quickly becoming the greatest cyclists of all time. But again, like in all seriousness, this doesn't just apply to my components. Again, because we're using CDD, these changes are now applicable to all components on the page rendered in the UI. So that's a very limited example of a React application. If you are going to sort of like follow React anymore, and sort of I've looked at the resources which Next.js has regarding applications in React, it doesn't go much deeper than this, so this is fine. If you wanted to explore React further, I'd really recommend getting to grips with use effects would be the next hook I'd look at. So we're done with the React application. Very quickly, I'm just going to do some refactoring, and what this will do is basically get this React application in the position you can start applying Next.js to it. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is install Next. So npm I is short for install Next into this project. And what you'll see is we now have Next sitting alongside React and React DOM. One of the interesting things you'll see if you've only worked with React, like up until this point, I'm thinking sort of like Mel, Tiffany, I know two people in the room who have worked with React. We have a lot of unnecessary files for an application at this point in time. So Babel. Babel is there to convert JSX into JavaScript. Well, remember, the entire point of Next is that we don't have this lag, we don't have this performance hit where we have to sort of give the browser an empty HTML file and then convert everything from JSX into JavaScript, build it, perform DOM manipulation, and then render it on the screen. We want to get to this point before the users, we want the user's browser or client to receive this information as it is. So we don't need Babel. We don't need Webpack. Next.js comes with built-in configuration for these tools as part of it. It's like, as part of what we just installed, it uses SWC, an acronym I can't remember what it stands for, but that's used instead of Babel to compile. It has Webpack built in internally to it. So with a lot of these things, we don't need our index HTML file anymore. We can delete that. Again, HTML has been an issue for us because our HTML file has been completely empty. Next.js is a tool designed to resolve the issues with that. Also, because of that, we can delete our .babel RC. We can remove our Webpack JS configuration. We're also, because we're not using Webpack, we're not going to bundle all of our individual files anymore. So I can also remove dist. Now, again, for those who are a bit more familiar with React and haven't sort of looked at Next.js yet, this can look quite sort of complicated. And I'm like, well, you're deleting everything which I know is a fundamental of building applications which live in the browser. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's like the holy trinity of the applications we need. And you're deleting the HTML file and our ability to bundle multiple JavaScript files into one. Well, again, React is a really popular tool, but it has limitations. And Next is a React framework specifically designed for React to help sort of resolve some of these issues. And you'll see how we get to the same point before we delete everything with Next.js instead. So the file structure that Next.js expects to find is an app directory to contain an application. So what I'm going to do is rename source to app. So you can see that now all these files think they exist inside a folder which doesn't exist. We've renamed source to app. Again, the naming conventions which Next expects, where Next will look when it tries to launch our application. And then if we cd into app, what we can also see is that, well, one thing which Next.js will do is look for a home page called page.js rather than app.jsx. Previously, we had index.html, which was an empty HTML file, which was linked to our index.js, where we had that create route, and then we passed in app. That's just like boilerplate. Ultimately, the app.jsx is the main page for our application. This is the first thing the user sort of practically sees as we're thinking of it as a vantage point of a developer. And what we need to do is rename app.jsx again to that next sort of standard convention expectation, which is page.js. And then the last thing I'll do is, because let's go ahead and call that page.js, is I will rename our app to be called homepage, just to be really clear with what the purpose of this component is for. Cool. So to execute this now, we don't want Webpack. We're not using Webpack anymore. We've progressed on to Next. So what I'm going to do is change the script from build, and we're just going to, in a development environment, we're going to change this to dev, and then next. And all we need to do is cd up to the parent level, and then execute npm run dev. Now, what we should be able to see is that it's saying, well, now we can look at our application on localhost 3000. If I click on that, let's see what we get. We get an error. Now this is fine. We expected to get an error at this point. If we go back to VS Code, what we should see is the file layout.js has just been generated. This is the main layout of our application. If we have UI elements in our code, which are shared across all pages, things like a header, things like navigation or a footer, we have the ability to add them to this layout.js file, and they'll be persistent across all different areas of the application, no matter which components we render and which sort of section of a component is in its life cycle. So this is fine. We're getting an error. It says you're importing a component that needs useState. It only works in a client component, but none of its parents are marked for the use clients. Okay, cool. Well, why is this? Well, earlier I said that the entire point of Next.js is to render our React applications before they're given to the clients for performance, and also because Google's bots can trawl HTML, which actually has content, so it can index our applications, and they can appear in positive, rankings in a Google search if they were to happen against whatever Google search should show our website. And the reason why we're getting this error is because Next.js, by default, is making sure that all our components are React server components, which is going to help us in render applications on the server before sending it to the client. So if we think back, one of the main things we're trying to limit is having empty HTML files, again, which is ruining our SEO and our performance. The problem is our server components don't support useState. useState is basically it's the memory within the browser which manages states, not something the server can do. And we still need to use a client component to handle that useState. So each environment has operations which are better suited for it. We could render a navigation component as a server component, as it's not going to change. And these can be resolved as straight HTML and sent to the client from the server. But imagine if within that navigation, we had a component for the links, and that links had some functionality attached to it, which showed which link was active. I mean, if that visually doesn't make so much sense, if we go to not sure if the BBC is going to be a good example, but we can see we've got this navigation. This can be generated in a server and sent as direct HTML to my browser. The links, however, this is a bad example. Imagine if I clicked on sport and then sport had this underline sort of consistently there. That couldn't be generated by the server because that's an action which explicitly takes place within the browser. And this is sort of the part of the issue we're seeing here right now, is saying, okay, you can generate a lot of what you built in the server, but this here, which is using useState, this has to be handled by the client, by the browser. So we have these two different graphs of components. We have this server module graph, and then this client module graph. And once the server components are rendered, data called the React server component payload is then sent to the client. And that includes two things. The rendered server components containing all that HTML, and then the gaps in that HTML, which needs to be filled by the client components. So all that we need to be aware of is how to make certain components client components, because by default, they want to be treated as server components. So in our error message, we can we can see that it says, because we're using useState, we need to make it a client component. To do that, this is very straightforward and the easiest thing we'll do today. We need to find the component which is using useState. So if I close all this down, we know that is our cyclist component, which is using useState to track the amount of stage wins any cyclist has. And then all we need to do at the very top of this file is add the text use clients, followed by a semicolon. And then what should hopefully have happened if I save this, the error goes away and we're back to the same place we were, where our app, well, no longer our app actually, page.js is a server component. All this is being rendered before it gets sent to the client. The button is being rendered by the server and it's being sent to the client. The gap in this application is our cyclist component, which is making use of view states. Everything else is built, and then the functionality behind the cyclist is then filled in the browser, and then we get our application working as we expect. And that's a really base sort of entry point into Next.js. I really hope you found that interesting. What I'll do is I've got a link which is from Next.js themselves. There is a module on sort of React before this, which it recommends you go through. What I've gone through myself, I think is basically all the React you'll need, plus a little bit more about how to get started with that. So if you are interested in learning more about Next.js, I'll share this link in the chat. I'll recommend sort of this to be what you use sort of to continue learning and getting up to speed with a really, really interesting technology. So I'll post that in the chat now. That is me done. Again, I hope you found that interesting. Are there any questions you have before I say goodbye?